I predicted that Russia would invade the Ukraine. Eventually, Taiwan was going to be invaded by China. I'm Steve Ttown. I came to Japan 34 years ago with the U.S. military. So the self-defense forces are very capable. They do as well as any military that I have ever worked with. And I think they do not get the credit they deserve. The apex of the relationship between the U.S. forces and the Japanese self-defense forces was demonstrated during the response to the Eastern Japan earthquake. And I don't believe we would be defeated today if there was a war.
So, Steve, can you start by introducing yourself and sharing with us why you chose this theme for your book?
So, I'm Steve Ttown. I came to Japan 34 years ago with the U.S. military and was serving with the United States Army. And I served until I retired in 2012 when I was a colonel. I then went to work for an American defense contractor, and while I was working with the defense contractor, a friend of mine was asked, a Japanese friend, was asked if he'd write a book on missile defense. He told the publishing company that the person that he thought could do the best job of writing a book about missile defense was myself. So they came to me and asked if I would consider writing a book about Japan and the missile defenses of Japan. And I said, sure. And while we were writing the book, it became apparent that there was a bigger story here. And the story really is that the Japanese military is very capable. The Japanese military, or as they would call it, the self-defense forces, are well trained, and that Japan is well defended with the cooperation between the United States and Japan. So the book ended up covering both missile defense, the Japanese military, and then the third aspect was the Operation Tomodachi and the response to the Great Eastern Japan earthquake and how we responded jointly to that. And I happen to have been the director of the bilateral operations at Ichigaya, the Japanese headquarters. And so my experiences come out in my book about our relationship between the self-defense forces and the U.S. military and the relationship of Japan to the United States.
Thank you. That's such a unique career.
Yeah.
And first time you came to Japan was when you were 2, right?
The first time I came to Japan, I was 2 years old. My parents were missionaries, and so I grew up in Shikoku, went to school in Kobe, and was here in Japan until the 7th grade, until I was 14 years old.
So what was your impression of self-defense force?
So the self-defense forces are very capable. They are well trained, they are very dedicated, and they do as well as any military that I have ever worked with. And I think they do not get the credit they deserve for being as well prepared for conflict.
So how would you describe cooperation between the self-defense force and the U.S. military during the Eastern Japan earthquake?
So, like all relationships, there are better times and not as good as times. But I think almost without a doubt, the apex of the relationship between the U.S. forces and the Japanese self-defense forces was demonstrated during the response to the Eastern Japan earthquake. It was very good cooperation, and even though it wasn't perfect, the reality was that together we demonstrated that we were very capable of working hand in hand with each other. And I thought that it was a great demonstration of the many years of training, the many years of exercises that we had done together coming into a culmination of actually doing a real operation that benefited the Japanese people.
And you are leading 友達作戦.
That was what it was called in Japanese, Tomodachi Saksen, or Operation Friendship. Yeah, it was. I was the director of the operations center at the headquarters within the Japanese headquarters. So basically, I was responsible for all the coordinations between the South Defense Force and the U.S. forces, which were headquartered at Yokota Air Base.
What is your opinion regarding the cooperation between Japan and the United States?
So, if you take that relationship above the relationship between the military and military and look at nation to nation, it's just like our military relation. At times it's better than others. I find that the times when our two nations seem to work the best together is when our leadership worked the best together. And that was example when Ronald Reagan and Nakasone were president and prime minister. They're both conservative, both the same ideas, and had a very great relationship. When Trump and Abe were together, they were both conservatives and they both worked very well together. You've got a political relationship, you've got a military relationship. Most important though, is people-to-people relationship. The Japanese people admire the United States, and Americans generally, even though they don't know as much about Japan as they probably should, they think Japan is a great nation. So there's this mutual respect, mutual understanding that together we are wonderful partners. So different than when World War II was going on. We were at odds, we were enemies.
Right.
But the surprising thing is after the war, we worked together to build a friendship. And we have been building that relationship over the last 70 years.
It's pretty rare for Asian country to join a Western team.
Yeah.
So Japan is one of the few countries.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it happened?
I think it happened because after the war, the Japanese people expected the United States to be cruel and unusual victor. And instead, the United States came into Japan with the attitude of recovering, developing, rebuilding a nation. And it was surprising to the Japanese people that another nation would treat them this way. And so that surprise and that recognition that America wasn't going to be the evil empire that they had been told that it was prior to the war, made them want to join with the American team. And the Americans were, I will say it, a benevolent victor. They took care of Japan, and they really partnered with Japan. And it made Japan able to harness its capability to revive a country that was devastated by a war to becoming one of the leading nations within the world. And I think, in fact, when I first came to Japan in the early 90s, everybody knew that the GDP of Japan and the United States was half of the world's GDP. It was amazing that two countries together had so much acquired wealth and capability. So for that reason, I think it was just a natural fit that two nations reconciled and decided, rather than to be enemies, to be friends. And that continues to this day.
So the book was published in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been 6 years.
Yes.
And have there been significant changes in the world situation?
Well, of course, the world situation has changed drastically since I wrote this book. I would point out, though, that on page 153, I made a little graph, and I wrote about this. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a map, and there's three things on that map, and that is that I predicted that Russia would invade the Ukraine. I also predicted that North Korea would send more and more missiles over Japan. and that eventually Taiwan was going to be invaded by China. Two of those three have come true. I still expect China to somehow do something with Taiwan, and that's a very large and dangerous threat to our region. And that's why I think it's important to have a book like this that talks about the strength of the Japanese Self-Defense Force, because that in itself is deterrence to create a situation that will preserve the peace. Nobody wants a war. I don't want to see China invade Taiwan. I expect it, and because I expect it, I prepare for it. And because I'm prepared for it, it may prevent it from happening. That's the way I look at it. So I'm hoping that praising the Japanese military and speaking to the point of our unity and our capability of working together, that it allows us to maintain the balance of power within the region and prevent the war from happening. Of course, there's been other things in the world. Russia invaded China. Russia invaded the Ukraine. That happened. The war is going on in Israel today. Mm-hmm. I think one of the more significant things that has happened in the last 6 years was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that was a very unsettling situation for this region, because the United States had promised to protect Afghanistan and the Afghanistan people. And by withdrawing in the manner it did, causing the collapse of a nation and the taking over of the Taliban, who we had been fighting, it demonstrated that America at this time was weaker than it had been. And so as relationships grow, and I believe the U.S.-Japan relationship has gotten better and better with minor ups and downs, I would say right now we are in one of our most dangerous periods. Because there's this perception that America is a bit weaker than it ever has been. And because of that weakness, that makes the relationship between U.S. and Japan all the more important. And it also means that Japan's share of the burden has grown. Whether they want it or not, Japan has become more significant in its role in this region. So working together, cooperating, training as militaries, working economically together is more important than ever between the U.S. and Japan.
Thank you. So, what are your insights into the current and future outlook on security, given the changing global power dynamics?
Yeah. So, currently, I explained that we are in a period of instability. Someone would say even a period of fear because of what China is doing. I think long term, though, that because of our relationship, that even if there was a war with China, that long term our relationship between the Japanese people and the American people will remain strong. And the security in this region will always rely on a good U.S.-Japan relationship. So if there's a war, we'll fight it together. If there's not a war, we'll continue to work together. But the reality is that whatever China decides to do, China will face a joint U.S.-Japan challenge. And there will be other countries that join us in protecting this region. And I don't believe we would be defeated today if there was a war. And that's what I talked about in this book. And that's because of the strength of the Japanese self-defense forces and the partnership we have together.
But how about future in China? I think they are waiting for Japan to be weakened, or relationship between Japan and America be weakened.
Well, China is always trying. trying to make us not get along. China is in a terrible crisis right now, that they have many inherent problems within their own system. Economic problems, Uyghurs with the Tibetans. So many differences, completely opposite perspectives. Japan is taking a greater role and responsibility to do more for the defense of Japan. Any nation should have the ability to use any means to defend itself.